And now we're marrying that to new drilling techniques. It used to be that you'd have a single pad on the surface. It would send down one pipe a mile and then go laterally 600 feet. That was back in 2005. 6 years later, that horizontal spur went from 600 to 6,000 feet, 10 times the reservoir contact for the same cost on the surface. As of 2 years ago, we had pad drilling. We combined all that surface infrastructure and sent everything down from the same point. And now we have multilateral drilling. One pipe going down up to 20 miles of horizontal spurs. The input cost for steel, for sand, for water, for labor has dropped by 80% in the last 2 years. That's why we have oil output in this country that is actually rising, despite the fact we have only 15% the same number of drills and oil prices below $30. Which gives us this. Here's the price structure as of 4 years ago. The horizontal is the volume of oil produced. The vertical is the cost per barrel. Back in 2012, way over there on the left was US shale. Not a lot came out, and it was very expensive. With these new technologies, here's where we are today. The break-even cost on average in the American shale fields is now just over $40 a barrel. It'll probably be pushing $30 by the end of this year, which will make US shale cost competitive with every oil patch in the world outside of the Persian Gulf itself. We are, in the energy sector, not waiting for shale production to fall off. We're waiting for those politically unstable places like Venezuela or Nigeria to see their output collapse. That's what would correct prices under normal circumstances at this point. It's not going to be a shale correction. It'll be others. Which gives us this for liquids. The blue is American oil production. Red and green, imports from our friends in Canada and Mexico. The double hash is 2007. That's when commercially viable volumes of crude came in from the shale fields for the first time. You can see the spike in output since then. Here's consumption. Well, that's interesting. What's going on there? What happened in 2007 that made that flatline and drop? Well, three things. One, we had a recession. Industrial output dropped. Energy consumption dropped with it. Second, we have something called demand destruction. When you're convinced that oil prices are going to be higher for longer, you invest, you personally and you and your corporation, invest in things that will reduce your energy footprint. You buy a Prius, you put up solar panels. And those don't just destroy demand when you're using them or when you own them, but they're part of the fleet for the next 20 to 30 years because it's a freaking Toyota and they just don't break down. And then there's demography. Because when you're 35, you take your kids to soccer practice and you drive to work. When you're 55, you just drive to work. And when you're 75, you don't drive much at all because the kids keep taking away your keys. Per capita oil demand declines with age. And in 2007, the oldest of the baby boomers retired. We are looking at 10 to 20 years of secular energy decline. Demand decline in the United States, which means that that black line and that stack of colors will probably cross in the next year or two. And that assumes no spike in prices that makes the shale drillers just suddenly drop a bunch of pipes into the ground. That could make it happen in 6 months. The world of oil, it's not entering a new normal. It's convulsing, and what comes out of it will be anything but normal. Now, this is what it looked like on the dawn of shale. You had two mammoth markets. Western Europe, North America. Each of them took crude from 30 different places. Lots of arbitrage opportunities for the super majors. Very messy. And if you had a cargo that you couldn't find a home for, you sent it to Asia, dear sweet Asia, because they would take whatever they could get. There is no oil production of consequence in East Asia. So you have the world's largest supply route to a very thirsty area, and they had to pay a premium because of that. Today, things have changed. The shale revolution has knocked 7 million barrels per day off of the American import bill. 7 million. 3/4 of that was from OPEC. Western Europe has proven that you can make a financial crisis the new normal. They have not had economic growth on average since 2006. And it doesn't look like they're going to break out of it anytime soon, in part, increasing in part, because of their demographic implosion. Which meant that if you wanted to sell your crude anywhere, you had to get it to an Asian country. Instead of them taking the scraps, they were the only game in town. So the Asian premium turned into an Asian discount. That's one of the reasons why the Chinese build-out in plastics has been so successful of late. They're paying less for the crude. But here's where we're going. You remove the American security guarantee. You change the global demographic. And you get a sharp break in the market and a breakdown in the ability to export crude from large portions of the world. Now, oil has a derivative called naphtha, which fuels the plastics industry. We are looking at a global oil and global naphtha shortage of a scale we have not seen since 1942. But not everywhere. Because in the United States, the supply is local. And it's even worse than that, because shale crude is very light, very sweet. That's the exact crude you want if you want a high naphtha cut. So while the rest of the world is starving for naphtha, North America will be swimming in it. Here's how it's going to break down. First of all, let's talk about the Russians. Now, that red splotch, that is majority Russian populations. The Russians have a series of severe physical geography barriers on the western edge of that red zone, the tallest of which is about the same height as a Kansas interstate on-ramp. It's just flat open. You can walk across it. Ask any German. They love to march through this area. Now, the way the Russians look at this, they see 3,500 miles of open terrain. And what they want to do is they want to forward position their troops in these gaps between these seas and between these mountains. And if they can achieve that, the amount of vulnerable territory shrinks from 3,500 miles to 600 miles. And they can do that with an army half the size that they have now. So Ukraine is just step one, and the Russians do not see this as an offensive war. They see it as a defensive war. That's a problem if you use Russian crude, because here is the Russian oil export network, almost all of which goes through the conflict zones and through the areas that the Russians want to pre-position. So you're looking at 5 to 6 million barrels per day of crude oil export capacity that at a minimum is at a degree of severe risk. If you're using Russian crude to make your naphtha, game over. Middle East. Now, there's any number of ways that I could talk about the Middle East, especially how the Saudis and the Iranians are now at each other's throats. There's political differences, demographic differences, religious differences, ethnic differences, and now, because of shale, economic differences. They're both trying to export exactly the same crude along exactly the same route to exactly the same end customer, because North America is no longer in the game. But really, just think of it as like the UT-Texas A&M rivalry, just with more guns. And like all of the world's great rivalries, eventually fans end up in the wrong bar. This is Khuzestan, aka Kyle Field. This is home to 3 million ethnic Arabs in Persian Iran. The Saudi intelligence services are working to foment a rebellion in this area, specifically to throw the Iranians off their game. Why there? Well, those Arabs live on top of 80% of Iran's oil production capacity. Down here at the UT Tower, aka the Gwar Superfield, you have 2.5 million religious Shia living in Sunni Saudi Arabia. And the Iranian intelligence services are trying to do the same thing down here that the Saudis are doing in Khuzestan. Just those two areas, that's 11 million barrels per day of oil production capacity. And that assumes nobody gets caught in the crossfire. There are already 5 hot wars going on in the Middle East with these two backing opposite sides. Syria, by the way, is what it looks like when the Saudis are winning. 20 million barrels per day is at threat in the Persian Gulf.